The future of Canadian media. It's a topic that keeps me awake at night. Hi, I'm Brian Lilley, and in conversation today with Peter Menzies, who you can find him at The Rewrite. Of course, he's someone who's had a long career in journalism, freelance writer now at The Rewrite, The Line. You can see him at times at The Hub as well, but someone who had a career with the Calgary Sun, the Calgary Herald, and then the CRTC. Peter, your career is kind of the opposite of mine. You were an ink-stained wretch. You were a print guy, and then you went on the board of the broadcast regulator. I was in radio and TV bristling under the said CRTC, which I would love to dismantle if they gave me 5 minutes.
Yes.
And now I've moved into the writing side. So welcome. Thanks for joining me to talk about the future of media.
Oh, thanks for your interest. It's a topic that fascinates me too.
Well,
'Cause there has to be one.
Well, yeah. I mean, people are consuming things. They don't necessarily want to pay for them. They will pay for them in some instances, but kind of everyone knows the model's broken, but nobody seems quite sure how to fix it. So you were testifying before the uh, Commons Heritage Committee recently. I've done that in the past. They asked me to do it this time. I couldn't make it work, and then decided I would just sit it out. That you've already heard from lots of great people. They don't need to hear from me. But one of your messages, among many, was um, don't subsidize production, subsidize consumption. So I want to get into that in a minute, but let's talk about the impact of subsidies. I still hear from people, Peter, that think we're getting the Trudeau era subsidies, that $600 million fund, and they think we're all bought and paid for. The various subsidies over the year have had a real impact on trust that the public has in the media, I think. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think that was always the high risk and the sort of continuation of what initially even the industry was saying. Bob Cox had testified, I think it was to the Finance Committee in 2018 before the tax credit, the journalism labor tax credit came in, that no, even the industry didn't want anything more than some sort of temporary assistance while they went through this transition, as they called it at the time, to digitization, which, I mean, if you were just starting to transition in 2019, you were already in trouble. But I think they knew that themselves, and that it was going to have an impact on trust. And as I told the Heritage Committee, this isn't a slag on any journalist. I think there's lots of journalists out there who are still doing their job, pure as the driven snow as they did before. But the fact of the matter is there's no getting around the fact that people view a subsidized media, a government subsidized media, with suspicion. And it does diminish trust. The media depends as much on trust as it does on advertising, in a sense, in the long term. So when that diminishes, it darkens the future.
So those subsidies, the Trudeau era subsidies, are gone. It was amazing to me that I would hear from people who were strong defenders of CBC, of which I am a strong critic of CBC, as most people that follow me know, who would attack the private sector media for taking those subsidies. But that was only a fraction of what CBC gets every year. They are completely subsidized and yet viewed as trustworthy. How do you explain that?
You don't really, but it kind of brings into the broader point that one of the problems with the media industry is that, I mean, certainly with government, what it does is government always tends to respond to lobbyists. So one group shows up lobbying for broadcasters, they listen to them. Another group shows up lobbying for what we used to call newspapers, and they listen to that. And then somebody shows up lobbying for the CBC. What we really need to do is think about a national news industry policy that throws everybody in the same bucket. You can't have these separate. I mean, I know newspapers and broadcasters have always been at each other's throats and compete with each other, but they've got to get their act together. And the CBC's role, how can you have a healthy industry when you have one player, the largest single player, as it turns out, um, acting as a commercial competitor and being subsidized? This is not a level playing field in it in any under any definition, right? So if you have, I mean, imagine if you're trying to run a restaurant. You're in the restaurant business and you're trying to run a restaurant, whereas the guy down on the corner, the largest chain in the country, is being subsidized by the government. So it can offer more
Free
food
lunch.
at lower prices. How can you compete? You can't, right? Under those sorts of conditions, and provided the government continues to allow the CBC to sell advertising and compete online and on TV, and I mean, charging for gem as subscriptions and that sort of stuff, as long as it's a commercial competitor and that heavily subsidized, nobody else has a chance. And that almost never comes up in these discussions, right? Actually, Pierre Carl Pelado brings it up constantly, but others don't.
I may have worked for PKP at one point,
Yes.
and I think you may have enjoyed how much I was willing to criticize CBC, because most people in our industry will not. Either they work there, they want to work there, or they're getting a nice little stipend for appearing on these political chat shows. And so there's very few in Canadian media who want to criticize CBC. And I view them as one of the biggest impediments to um, the rest of Canadian media surviving. So I'll give you a couple of examples and then get your thoughts. I grew up listening to 900 CHML, hometown radio in Hamilton. It's gone now. It's gone. It was a heritage station that had been around forever. Um, and like a lot of mid-sized markets, and Hamilton is not a major market anymore. It's a mid-sized market. These stations were going to be struggling anyway. But what happened a couple years before? CBC went in and set up, at a time when they were saying, we don't have enough money, government needs to give us more money. Our annual allotment from Parliament's not enough for us to do our job. They went in and started a CBC Hamilton newsroom. They didn't get a broadcast license. They just set up an online streaming thing. And it's done well, but it completely undermined the local private competitors. I mean, these are um, uh, longtime broadcast stations that had their audience taken away from them by a government subsidized entity. I hear people say, well, you guys should just put up a paywall and charge people. How do you run on a pure paywall system when CBC is giving everything away for free? So they've got the biggest newsrooms in the country, plus they subscribe to all the wire services, Canadian Press, Reuters, etc., and they post all of that, and it's all free. And I'm going to put up a paywall and get you to give me money for the online version that you can just get for free at CBC. I mean, these are all problems. They even have an online streaming music service that essentially competes with Apple and Spotify. Um, why the Canadian taxpayer needs to pay for someone else to be able to listen to the latest Elton John or Beyonce or Taylor Swift song is beyond me, but it's there.
Yeah, no, and they even took Radio Canada International, I mean, in a manner that I'm quite sure violates the Broadcasting Act, and nobody made a fuss. Well, some employees made a fuss, and they turned it into basically multicultural radio, ethnic radio station. So now, again, those guys, most of those guys are little guys. There's all kinds of them in Toronto. There's about 20 of them, I think.
And then you've got a
But now
chain starting
CBC
with,
is competing with them too, right?
yeah, so you've got Red FM, which is trying to be a national chain of multi-ethnic channels. And yeah, it you know, I'm forgetting his last name suddenly, James, who started iPolitics years ago. Um, he, I remember him saying to me, every time I come up with a new way, because iPolitics, when it started, was a very fresh way of attracting a specific audience. He said, every time I come up with something new to grow my business, CBC comes in and either steals the idea or hires my employees because they can pay a higher salary. And that's what they're doing with the ethnic media as well.
Yeah. And so one of the things you could do, forward thinking, if the government was, is that if you're going to have a public broadcaster, and there are arguments that favor that, particularly for the far north, etc. But if you're going to have one, it should be a benefit to the news ecosystem, not a detriment. And right now, it might be people will argue that it's a benefit to the public, and there are cases where that's the case, but it's damaging the rest of the industry, right? So why can't you, so what can you do to turn that into a benefit? One of the things you could do is make all of CBC's content available to all of its competitors for free, so that there is, you could maintain its uh, intellectual property rights internationally, as with the CBC, but you could also make the content available to its private sector, post media, whoever, all throughout the country, right? So it would become essentially, in a sense, what Canadian press has been, where it becomes a news provider for everybody else. So it's not competing with, but it's generating news that everybody can deliver on their platforms. And if you get it out of the business of being a commercial competitor, I mean, I'm not saying that's the entire solution, but these are the sorts of ideas that I think should be examined when you're doing that. Because you could get, some of the industry's problems aren't going to go away if CBC goes away, but you absolutely have to get CBC to go away as a commercial competitor, and have it become a partner, and a provider within the news ecosystem, not a
If
destroyer, and it's a destroyer right now.
if I if I'm in the UK, if I went to visit my Uncle Joe in Glasgow and I'm sitting on the BBC's website, I would not see ads as I read one of their news stories. There'd be no ads
That's right.
aimed at me no matter what. But here, internationally, if I go on the BBC's website, um, I'm going to see ads. That's something the
Yeah.
British government did years ago that
Yeah.
I think you could easily emulate here. Just tell them, look, you cannot compete commercially. Um, I would like to see them weaned off of ads on television as well, but that might be too big of an ask. I mean, their TV revenue is shrinking because their audience is shrinking, but
Yeah, I mean, publishers were actually raising the alarm bells at almost 10, well, it was 10 years ago now. I remember doing some research into finding, a Heritage Committee meeting. I think it was back in 2016, at which Phil Crawley, from the publisher of the Globe and Mail, and
I
others,
sat next to Phil that day on committee.
yeah, raising the alarm, saying, "Look, CBC, you got to stop CBC from this digital invasion." And you could see it at the time. CBC, the positions they were posting weren't for producers, right? They were for editors, right? They were becoming a newspaper. So the CBC, not that quietly, but it actually launched a national newspaper online 10 years ago, and began competing and doing things like you described in Hamilton. I heard
Well,
the
they
same in
went
Kitchener.
into
There's
the
all kinds of places where they don't have a stick, a broadcasting stick, but they've launched online portals to compete with, and in many cases, help destroy the local newspaper or radio station.
the Kitchener Waterloo Record, which is I that's with my competitor, the Toronto Star, but I believe it's greatly diminished. Do they still
Yeah,
publish a physical paper, the KW Record? I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either, but it was a very distinguished paper title at one time.
Hmm. Uh, Beyond CBC, the subscription model that you talked about, or the subsidy model for subscriptions that you talked about. Explain that to me. What do you, what is your argument and how would it work?
Okay, so it kind of comes from my experience at the CRTC, where there's all kinds of funding goes to create Canadian content, right? And all the focus is. I remember my early days at the CRTC, meeting the folks from the I think it was called the Canada Television Fund at the time, or Film and Television Fund. It's now the Canada Media Fund, and they came to give a presentation, and all they could talk about, what they talked about, was how they had successfully distributed $300 million for the production of all these programs. And the question, did anybody watch them, didn't really come up. The system was all about production, that we were successful so long as we were producing Canadian content. Um, and as we all know, it hasn't actually been that big a success in terms of consumption. So you'd think you'd kind of learn from that when you're looking at other sort of structures. So if you establish that the public good is not whether the Kitchener-Waterloo record lives or dies, because why should we shouldn't really care about one individual title. It's sad when they go, but that can't be. The public good has to be that you have a well-informed public with a shared understanding of the facts, and that the basic facts, and that people can organize their lives around these things. So in order for them to do that, they have to be consuming news. Right? You can produce all the newspapers and all the broadcasts you want, kind of like CBC television news. If nobody's listening to it, right, or nobody, what are you actually achieving? So you look around and think about. So what I was thinking about is that um, and this isn't the solution unto itself. This would be one of the things you need to do. Is you need to subsidize consumption. So you subsidize you or me as a media consumer through tax credits or tax deductions. So if I buy a subscription to your paper, when I file my taxes, I get a tax deduction for that. Now, I would argue that should be at least as high as political parties get, which is 70%. I would actually go for the whole enchilada, but that's never going to happen.
They get
Um,
75%. It's just like a federal government charity,
yeah,
75% tax rebate.
right, right. So, but if you should do that for media consumption up to a say a limit of $1,000 or something like that, and then when you're doing that, you're subsidizing the consumer, right? And then the consumer can choose where they're going to spend that money. Could be the Toronto Star if they're liberal. Could be National Post if they're the Toronto Sun if they're lean more conservative. It could be both. They could be it could be and their local paper, that sort of stuff. But the consumer is free to choose. They're the one that gets subsidized, but the money does flow through to the publishers in that sense. But they have to, as they do now, but then they have to really compete for the loyalty of those readers. There's other examples, and I think that manages your trust issue because the money isn't going directly to the publishers. The money's going to me, and I get to decide where I spend it. If I want to, like I said, or you, and the consumer decides where they spend it. There's other tricks, like I mentioned in the Heritage Committee in Portugal, for instance. The government pays for um, subscriptions for 15 to 18-year-olds for 2 years. So it introduces them to to the news system, which they might not be. They're not growing up like you and I did with a morning paper on the door and dad coming home from
And
work.
when I was a paper boy for the Hamilton Spectator, um, you were the weird people if you didn't have a paper delivered.
Yeah,
I had a very dense route. It was great, as a 11-year-old delivering the paper. So it was very common. It's not now. And, you know, local TV news does okay, but um, I'd be shocked if there's very many, take CTV. How many local CTV channels outside of Toronto CFTO um, still have significant audiences or are making money?
Yeah,
We
very.
heard Bell the other day say that their news division is losing 40 million a year.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's again an example of sort of hanging on to old ideas, and that's one of my big issues with both the Online News Act and the Online Streaming Act is the mentality is all looking backward. How do we preserve things as they were? Remember when and like, like you say, when Dad walked home from the bus and picked up the paper, sat down on the evening paper, even in those days, sat down on the couch and lit his pipe, right, while he waited for supper and read the newspaper. These are fantasies from the past, and same with television. I mean, I was given a hard time by one of the conservative MPs at the Heritage Committee about the lack of weekend news anymore in Saskatoon. Well,
Oh, yeah.
Nobody watches that anymore, so why make the broadcasters continue to lose money doing that? Why shouldn't you be focused on how are we going to help not just even the broadcasters so much sense, but those broadcast news organizations deliver their news in a modern, efficient, and somewhat financially stable, fashion instead of doing these silly ventures back into the past.
And conservative MP Kevin Waugh, who spent years as the um, CTV sportscaster
Yeah,
on
yeah,
CTV Saskatoon, he still wants the noon news program to come back.
I know.
Um, those never had big audiences.
No.
So I mean, this particular to broadcasting, and so drawing your CRTC hat here. How did a print guy end up at the CRTC? CRTC is, let me say this. As I mentioned off the top, I've been bristled under their yoke for years, and I have no love for the organization. I don't think that it's an organization that um, has the best interest of the industry or the public in mind. Sorry, I'm in downtown Toronto. You might be hearing lots of sirens go by.
Yeah,
Um, There's an organization that's now been put in charge of the internet by the Liberal government, and their website looks and runs like it was designed in the Netscape Navigator era of the late 1990s. How can they be in charge of the internet? Was it you that was pointing out for several days that their website was down and they're in charge of the internet, or was that
yeah.
someone else?
It was probably somebody else. I have occasionally mentioned it, but yeah, their website is something to behold.
But
Particularly for an organization that they know that internally that all they hear from are their codependents or stakeholders, as they call them. They never hear from the public.
so, but
Well, I mean, if you're a member of the public and you go to their website, you will grab grab your security blanket and run screaming into the night, sort of thing.
the idea of TV news and radio news came out of the fact that, um, other than CBC, which was set up by the government, these were private companies using a public good because they were broadcasting over the public airwaves. Um, and so, in exchange for the right to have a broadcast license and use the public good of the airwaves, you had to give back in the form of news. And so there have always been requirements around how much news you have to produce, um, how much of it has to be original Canadian content, etc. It, how do you deal with that in the online streaming world, or do you? Because eventually these broadcast outlets will just die. That will happen. I think they will die before newspapers do. Uh, we will still be getting the content, but how many people have cut the cord and don't have cable anymore, and all they watch are whatever's on offer from the streaming platforms. I don't think there is a legal or moral argument that can be made that the streamers should be paying for news just because the broadcasters used to. I know the federal government is trying that, and if they push ahead in the middle, especially in the middle of the negotiations over Kuzma, if they push ahead with telling Amazon and Apple that they have to pay for local TV news in Canada, that's going to become a sticking point for the Trump administration and cause us all kinds of headaches. So it's just a bad idea. But what do you do given the changing landscape?
Well, the really disappointing thing about the Online Streaming Act is that it was all about. I mean, the CRTC actually came out with a report around that time, when the ideas of the Online Streaming Act called harnessing change, right? And it's kind of like, how do we rein this change in, right? And it's kind of like, you're getting it wrong, guys. How do we ride this bull should be the mission, right? There's like the significance of the internet, the development of the World Wide Web is still hasn't sunk into people. To me, it's every bit as significant as the development of the printing press. It changes everything. You can't go back. So the Online Streaming Act assumes that how do we preserve the system, that CRTC based system that we've had for the last 40, 50 years. And it treats the internet as if it's the new cable, essentially. And it then, as you pointed out, it actually tries to um, shift the burden of our cultural funding offshore, so that we're actually going to depend upon American companies to fund Canadian cultural content and or Canadian cultural ambitions. Now, those big companies should definitely contribute to the tax base and in a meaningful way. You can't just come to Canada, plunder it, and take the money like pirates and leave. You have to make a contribution. But Canada, particularly in this Trump era, as Prime Minister Carney has sort of said, we need to be more standing on our own 2 feet. The Online Streaming Act has nothing to do with standing on our own 2 feet. That has
Yeah.
to do with getting the American companies to help us.
I find it bizarre that that's his message, and the way he has chosen to deliver it, both with the video with the little figurine of Sir Isaac Brock and the Canada Strong Fund, is that he records a video, uploads it exclusively to YouTube, puts teasers on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and X, and tells everyone to go to YouTube to watch his message about Canada and our independence and strength. It's the message and the medium are not the same.
Yes, and 91% of his investments are in the US.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't think they're in the Canada Strong Fund, but most of his family lives, works, or studies in the US. So I'm not saying people shouldn't do that, but you can't, both of these things. This is an example where two things cannot be true at the same time in terms of setting examples and creating national ambitions. But the whole CRTC framework should be stripped down. I mean, you do need regulation of the airwaves to make sure that airline pilots aren't suddenly getting a hard rock station when they should be talking to the control tower, spectrum management and that sort of stuff. But the whole thing should have been torn down and rebuilt on an internet, understanding that the internet is the core communications carrier into the future, not broadcasting, not none of this stuff. But it's very sad because you're right; they will all fail.
Um, I want to ask you about where the federal government puts its own advertising uh, money. Um, and I've been harping on about this for several years because they would offer us subsidies, but they wouldn't offer us advertising. And whatever complaint you have about mainstream media, they still do have an audience. People are still watching TV. They're still reading the newspaper, but in the online form. But when you look at where the federal government actually spends its money, and I'm going to share the screen. This is from their latest annual report on Government of Canada advertising. Um, just look at that there. Let me make sure that we are in a good setup. 64.1 million. So they did 78 million worth of advertising overall in fiscal year 24-25. 64.2 million is through what they call the AOR, Agency of Record. But 63% of that went to digital media, 37% to traditional media. And then when you look at who got the majority of the money, it's Meta, it's Google. And they want to fight the tech giants, but they're giving them all the money. In Ontario, the Ford government has said you've got to, government departments and agencies have to spend 25% of their advertising revenue in the province with traditional media publishers. It's, I believe Alberta, if they haven't done that yet, is looking at something similar, but the feds have outright refused. And so they will, uh, pay lip service to keeping traditional media alive, but then they turn around and, I'll show you the chart of where they advertise in a minute. It's going to the American tech giants that they constantly rail against. Should they be looking at saying, well, let's put our money where our mouth is?
Well, if you're going to pay advertising, advertisers will put it where they get the most readers. I mean, that goes to the fundamental problem that media have is that social media stole the eyeballs. That's where people have gone. I mean, um, I've got an old car to sell. I can put it on Facebook Marketplace, or for instance, right? Or if I want to buy one, I can shop there, or I can go directly to the dealer. I don't have to buy the Calgary Herald to read the automotive section to find out where the ads are. That sort
The
of stuff. That's been
classifieds are
going on.
long gone.
That's been going on for 20 years. Government advertising, you can make the argument for a difference. Like, you notice they still spend 37% there. I kind of wonder what is government advertising that is, that is so important. But nevertheless, they do. Yeah, you can make that argument, particularly in the sort of post-Trump era, that if we are going to be more independent of the United States, why is the government spending its money in the United States, essentially?
So
And when it could be spending it in Canada. Now, how it spends it, whether it's billboards, radio, TV, newspapers, that should be a competitive process. That should be still, where is the government going to get the best return on that investment, I think. Otherwise, it's just giving money away. You got to have people compete for readers still.
if you look at this bar chart, you see this off the chart number here, the big pale green line. That's during the pandemic. Meta, which runs Facebook and Instagram, made out like bandits during this. They were getting nearly $12 million a year at one point. You look at this little blue and white line, that's Twitter before Elon Musk owned it. And you watch the Twitter line, as soon as Elon Musk gets it, the advertising starts going down. Now it's nearly nothing. Pinterest is this little red line. Pinterest is still getting more money than traditional media. Here's the dollar figures of it broken down. Is still 2.4 million to LinkedIn. That was the biggest advertiser last year. Then Snapchat, then Meta. And let me switch to another one here and show you the traditional media. Yes. Okay. But traditional media, television's the top line, print is the bottom line. You scroll over. Well, looks like they increased television ads to 12 million over the last while, but all of print, $222,000 and 2.6 million on radio. I mean, you can make the argument that the eyeballs and the ears are still there, but they're not looking because they can go in and easily manipulate Facebook ads or LinkedIn ads and get greater demographic data than they can by going to a broadcaster or a print outlet.
Yeah, I mean the modern news organization, and call it broadcaster, call it print outlet, but they're basically all online entities these days. I mean,
Hmm.
Bell Media boasts, and I haven't seen the stats to back it up, that it's got the most read news platform in the country. For instance, CBC kind of makes the same boast, but its platform is more than just news. You got all kinds of stuff on it there.
Yeah,
But
I haven't seen the ComScore in a while, but believe it or not, the number one is Yahoo.
yes, yeah, no, it is that sort of stuff.
Yeah, Yahoo News is
Yeah.
it's mostly old guys looking at the financials, I think, because they they do have the best layout for watching your stocks portfolio go up and down. But I believe it's goes Yahoo News, then CTV, CBC, then Post Media's whole chain, and then goes from there. Weather Network in there as well.
Right, but the modern news organization should be able to provide advertisers with a pretty good demographic breakdown and targeted. It might not be as good as the foreign companies, but that is a like, I don't like, in my ideal world, there's sort of no form of direct subsidy. It sort of it's everything is built around a comprehensive national policy that includes everybody. That said, if you're going to do anything, it's a lot better to support those organizations through advertising. I mean, one of the arguments people were trying to make at the Heritage Committee was take away the tax credit for advertisers, Canadian advertisers. You know, if they're buying their advertising with a foreign company, don't allow that to be tax deductible. Now, I think you get into trade problems when you do something like that in the modern era, but that is another solution that says, if you that says to companies, okay, if you advertise with CTV Saskatchewan, that is tax deductible. If you advertise with Facebook in Saskatchewan, that's not tax deductible. That would be an incentive. You'd hear back from the advertisers saying, hey, well, I need to get a return on my investment, and these guys aren't giving it to me. But that said, in my experience in newspapers, a lot of people went to them for the advertising, not for the news. So, like, people will go. I mean, the biggest complaint, the biggest um, complaints I would get when I was publisher of the Calgary Herald was on a day, or even editor, wasn't about any column or something or news story somebody would write. You'd get some of those, but if people didn't get the Canadian Tire flyer in their Thursday morning paper, I mean, that was madness, right? Like, that was, you had a that was like a 7 alarm fire, trying to solve that problem. So people were driven to media because they could find their ads there. Um, yeah, that's something the government should seriously consider as part of a package of things. Take a look at that, because it would be, and people would still be competing for eyeballs, right? So you would still have to, if the government said we're going to spend this money domestically rather than foreign wise, all these guys would still have to compete for eyeballs to get their share of that advertising bundle.
I want to spend a couple minutes talking about a subject that's near and dear to your heart, and that is media bias. And then I'll let you get on with your day, Peter. Thanks very
Sure.
much for this. Um, Look, I'm an opinion guy. I have been for a long time, but when I started out, you had to earn your stripes to be able to become a columnist or a commentator. You had to spend years doing, um, you know, straight up journalism. Sure, there were always people that came from the outside that would do opinion pieces, but within media, you didn't start out as offering analysis or context. You told the facts. Your Substack, the Rewrite, is chock full of pointing out problems with uh, the media. You got that one headline: "Journalism's suicidal slide into context, aka opinionated reporting, is destroying public support." Carney gains unfettered power. Nation's most watched newscast dutifully celebrates. Laurentian love is in the air as smitten journos wonder, "Wherefore art thou, PMMC?" I take it you feel that we've got some biased coverage of the current government.
Yeah, it's not even just of the current government. I think there's been a trend, particularly in the last 10 years, away from some of the basics of aspirations of journalism. And the Globe and Mail example a few years ago, 3, 4 years ago, when they updated their policies and practices, journalists and ethics, they removed the word. They had decided after discussion with the staff that objectivity was no longer relevant, that that fairness was okay in terms of that, which that is a significant shift, and it's occurred at other. I shouldn't just bang on the Globe there, but it's occurred in all throughout the journalism industry, particularly in North America. And once because it's a sort of all part of this sort of wokeness trend, where it's sort of like we need to give, as that one headline pointed out, context, which is you're kind of allowing your own worldview to pervert your journalism, as opposed to understanding your own worldview and and pushing it aside and trying to be just a curious person who's trying to find out what's going on and what people think about it, and presenting it to people in as an objective a fashion as you can. Is objectivity, the argument against objectivity is, well, it's impossible, right? Well, you can make this same argument about a whole bunch of other things in life. If is 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 fidelity difficult for some people? Yes. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be an aspiration. Is loyalty difficult for some people? Obviously, for 5 floor crossers, that's an issue. But that doesn't mean you abandon it as an aspiration, and in terms of those sorts of things. So there's been this general trend, and the people coming out of journalism schools, which is kind of weird too. Like, to work at the CBC, you have to have a journalism degree, whereas when you and I were starting out, it was helpful, but it wasn't mandatory. And basically, you don't need to go to school for 4 years to learn how to be a journalist. If you can't figure it out in about 6 months, go sell shoes, right? Like, it's something that's an apprenticeship. You need to deal with tough editors, and you need to learn your craft, but it's a trade and it's a craft. But it's become this sort of middle class liberal culture that is doing news the way it wants to do, rather than, this is the biggest fault, rather than the way the readers want it. Study after study after study says, just tell me what happened and let me decide what it means, right? Or I can read a columnist to help me understand that. But it's that's one of the news industry's big problems, is its own behavior, and it is failing to address that.
Something you mentioned there reminded me of watching Breslin and Hamill, Deadline Artists. I just had to look up, make sure I got the title right. It was an HBO documentary on Jimmy Breslin and Pete Hamill, uh, two celebrated columnists at competing papers in New York, the Post and the Daily News. And they started out in journalism. They didn't go to journalism school. They went to grammar school and learned how to write. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, the industry has definitely changed a great deal. Anyways, I don't think we've solved all the problems of the media world today, Peter, but it's been great talking to you about it.
Yeah, no, thanks. I can get a little chatty about it, but really thank you for your interest, and good luck with everything.
All right, check out Peter Menzies at The Rewrite, and of course, check out me at Brian Lilley.